Here's the question. Nobody is asking clearly enough. The United States killed Iran's supreme leader, killed his wife, killed his defense minister, his army chief, his IRGC commander, all in the same strike, dropped bunker busters on Isfahan, struck over 1,250 targets across 24 of Iran's 31 provinces in the first 2 days alone. By every conventional military measure, by every metric that American planners have used to define decisive force since Desert Storm in 1991, this should have worked. The damage was real. The destruction was overwhelming. The demonstrations of capability were unambiguous, and Iran is still firing, not at a reduced rate that suggests eventual collapse, not in the desperate last gasps of a regime that knows it is lost, still firing in organized, deliberate sequential waves, 22 of them at the time of this video, still reaching targets across Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, the UAE, still putting missiles and drones in the air over Gulf bases that house American troops, still choosing to escalate rather than capitulate, despite absorbing the most intensive air campaign a democracy has conducted against another state in the modern era. Why? That is the question. And the answer does not come from the latest battlefield update or the newest satellite image. It comes from a book written in 1977 by a professor named Patrick Morgan, a book called Deterrence, a Conceptual Analysis, a book that CIA analysts used as foundational reading for decades to understand the basic logic of global conflict. And what Morgan wrote in that book reads today in 2026, not like a historical text. It reads like a diagnosis, a precise, almost uncomfortable diagnosis of exactly what is happening to the United States right now. Today, I want to explain the full picture, and not just what is happening on the battlefield, but why it is happening, the strategic logic underneath the missile counts, the academic framework that predicted this outcome before the first bomb dropped, and what it means for the future, not just of this war, but of American power globally. Let's start with the foundation, what deterrence actually is. Deterrence is not defense. Defense is stopping something after it starts, an interceptor shooting down a missile that has already been fired. Deterrence is stopping the decision to fire in the first place. Deterrence is making the threat of consequences so credible and so severe that a potential adversary decides the cost of acting is greater than the benefit. The weapon exists, so it never has to be used. The capability is demonstrated, so that demonstration itself does the work of prevention. The United States built its entire post-Cold War strategic architecture on deterrence. The aircraft carrier groups in the Gulf, the B-2 bombers at White-Itman Air Force Base in Missouri, the THAAD batteries deployed across the region, the F-35 squadrons in Qatar. None of that power was maintained primarily to fight wars. It was maintained to prevent them, to communicate one unambiguous message. Look at what we can do to you. Calculate accordingly. And for 3 decades after the Cold War, that message worked. Countries made their calculations. They looked at American power and they adjusted their behavior. They backed down. They negotiated. They found other ways. That strategy had a name in Morgan's framework. He called it general deterrence, the background gravitational field of American military power that shaped other states' behavior continuously without requiring any specific threat in any specific crisis. It operated all the time, even in peace, even in silence, simply through the weight of demonstrated capability and historical reputation. This was the foundation of the American-led international order for 30 years. And then on February 28, 2026, in the opening hours of Operation Epic Fury, general deterrence failed for the first time in the post-Cold War era against a state actor. Iran looked at everything America is capable of and decided to fight back anyway. To understand why, you need the second type of deterrence Morgan described. He called it immediate deterrence. This is deterrence in a specific defined crisis. There's a specific decision on the table, a specific threat being made. The clock is ticking. Immediate deterrence was what America was attempting in the days before February 28th. It was the implicit message behind the largest U.S. military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. It was the message behind 3 rounds of nuclear negotiations mediated by Oman. It was accept our terms, or face what we have positioned to deliver. Iran did not accept the terms, and Morgan wrote with a kind of precision that feels almost prophetic, now that immediate deterrence fails when the threatened party believes the cost of compliance is higher than the cost of the threatened punishment. This is the critical insight. The bomb only deters if the alternative to the bomb feels worse than the bomb itself. If the target concludes that surrendering is more destructive than being struck, the deterrence collapses. Not because the threat isn't real, not because the damage wouldn't be devastating, but because the calculation on the other side has already been made. That is precisely what happened in Thrawn. The American demand was not a moderate ask. It was total, permanently dismantle the entire uranium enrichment program. Except zero enrichment, a red line Iran has held for 20 years as a sovereign right under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, except under military duress, the condition that would strip the Islamic Republic of the primary strategic asset, nuclear latency, that had given it leverage, status, and a degree of protection for decades. A condition that, if accepted, would signal to every faction inside Iran, to every street protester demanding the regime's end, to every regional adversary calculating Iran's vulnerabilities, that the regime had broken under external pressure. The Real Clear Defense analysis published this week said something important. It noted that Iran in early 2026 was weaker than it had been in years, its proxy network dismantled, its economy collapsing, its population in open revolt. The moment was chosen not because Iran was strong, but because Iran was vulnerable and unlikely to survive a strike with its retaliatory capacity intact. The calculation was hit it while it is weak before it can rebuild. What the planners did not calculate was that a regime fighting for survival does not respond to the same cost-benefit logic as a regime trying to optimize its interests. A regime fighting for survival responds to a different calculus entirely. Morgan wrote it plainly. If the opponent believes the price of surrender is higher than the price of war, deterrence will not work no matter how powerful the attack is. The regime that accepts zero enrichment under military threat, that capitulates publicly to American demands at the barrel of a gun, that regime does not survive politically, not in the Iranian political context, not with the IRGC watching, not with a population told for 45 years that American imperialism is the source of their suffering. Surrender for the Islamic Republic was not painful. Surrender was terminal, and therefore, no matter how many B-2 bombers were on the runway. The deterrence calculation produced one answer. The cost of yes is higher than the cost of no. Fight. And here is where Morgan's framework becomes even more precise, because the failure of immediate deterrence was only the first stage. He wrote that once the targeted party survives the first strike and maintains the ability to respond, deterrence does not simply fail and stop. It degrades into something different. It degrades into attrition. A grinding war of endurance where the variables that determine the outcome are completely different from the variables that drove the original deterrence calculation. In the deterrence phase, what matters is capability, the weight of weapons, the credibility of the threat, the density of the strike package. America excels at the deterrence phase. The 1991 Gulf War lasted 100 hours of ground combat after 38 days of airstrikes. Yugoslavia was bombed into agreement in 78 days. The Taliban's conventional military collapsed in weeks. American deterrence and its rapid execution in those campaigns was devastating and decisive. The adversaries it faced did not reach the attrition phase. They either deterred or they collapsed fast. But in the attrition phase, the phase Morgan predicted deterrence degrades into when the target survives and maintains response capability, different variables dominate entirely. Not who has the most powerful weapons, but who can sustain the cost the longest. Not whose strike package is most precise, but whose domestic political system can absorb prolonged expenditure and casualties without breaking. Not whose military is most capable, but whose population has the deeper reserves of will. These are not American advantages. Iran has been under maximum economic pressure since 2018, 45 years of sanctions before that. It has been building its military doctrine around exactly this scenario, surviving the initial American strike, and transitioning to a prolonged asymmetric campaign for 4 decades. The underground missile cities built across every province. The dispersed mobile launchers moved out of fixed sites before the war began. The mosaic doctrine of distributed operations that cannot be decapitated by killing leadership. The 22nd wave of attacks after losing 86% of fixed launch capacity. This is not improvisation. This is 40 years of doctrine being executed as designed. Iran planned for attrition. America planned for deterrence or rapid collapse. And when deterrence failed and rapid collapse did not occur, the United States found itself in the one scenario its entire force structure and strategic culture was least prepared for. While the Global Security Analysis published this week called it war without endgame, it described the Trump administration's war aims as a bewildering array of conflicting impulses, a desire for quick victory, a refusal to commit ground troops, a hope for popular revolution, and a commitment to total military dominance, all existing simultaneously without a unifying strategic logic. War aims that include unconditional surrender, regime change, permanent nuclear dismantlement, and choosing Iran's next leader, stated publicly by the president and his senior officials, are not achievable through air power alone against a dispersed, distributed adversary with underground infrastructure. And the Clausewitzian warning that the global security piece cited is precise. War gravitates toward extremes in the absence of political guidance. Without defining what it wanted politically, the United States could not know how to end the war. And without knowing how to end it, the killing continues until exhaustion or escalation forces a conclusion. That is Morgan's attrition scenario, exactly described in real-time terms by analysts watching it happen. Now, I want to go deeper on the structural asymmetry between Iran's objectives and America's objectives. because this is where the analysis gets most uncomfortable for Washington and where most coverage refuses to go. Iran's objectives, as the Hudson Institute analysis published this week described them, are stark and consistent. Ensure regime survival. Retaliate proportionally to demonstrate that decapitation does not equal capitulation. Exploit American domestic and regional divisions. Extend the conflict long enough that American political will exhaust itself. The analysts noted, this calculation is rooted explicitly in watching U.S. withdrawals from Iraq and Afghanistan. Those objectives are achievable without winning a single battle. Iran does not need to defeat American military power. It needs to demonstrate that it was not defeated by American military power. Every missile wave that reaches a target is that demonstration. Every American base hit, every radar destroyed, every service member killed is evidence that the Islamic Republic survived the opening strike and maintained the ability to respond. That evidence politically is more valuable to Tehran than any territorial gain could be. America's objectives, by contrast, require actual achievement. Unconditional surrender, permanent nuclear dismantlement, regime change. These are not objectives that can be declared partially achieved. They are binary. Either Iran surrenders on American terms, or it does not. And Iran has made clear through 22 consecutive waves of retaliation that it will not. Which means America is in a war it cannot declare concluded on its own terms without either escalating to a level that its domestic politics and allied support will not sustain, or accepting an outcome that falls short of what it publicly committed to achieve. This is the trap Morgan described. Once deterrence fails and attrition begins, the side with maximalist objectives is structurally disadvantaged against the side with survival objectives, because survival can always be claimed. Unconditional surrender cannot be improvised. Now let's talk about what this means beyond Iran. Because the degradation of deterrence that Morgan described does not stay inside borders. It travels. It is being observed and processed in real time by every government on Earth that has calibrated its behavior around the assumption of American deterrence credibility for 30 years. Beijing, Pyongyang, Moscow. Every government that has been told implicitly and explicitly that American military power is the ultimate backstop of the international order. Those governments are now watching something different. They're watching the most intensive air campaign a democracy has conducted against another state in the modern era, and the target is still firing. They are watching the Thayad radar network get systematically destroyed. They are watching American service members killed. They are watching Iran's foreign minister sit on American television calm and undefeated and say, "We have no intention of negotiating. We are waiting for you." The Stimson Center analysis went somewhere most analysts have not been willing to go publicly. It raised the possibility that Iran, having watched its threshold nuclear posture fail to deter the attack, might draw the conclusion that threshold posture is insufficient, that the only reliable deterrence against American military action is a completed nuclear weapon. Not latency, not threshold. An actual device. A declared capability. The Stimson analysts were careful. They said this is not inevitable, but they flagged it as the most dangerous long-term consequence of Operation Epic Fury. Not the current fighting, but what happens when this war ends. And Iran's next leadership, possibly installed by the IRGC after watching the previous leadership killed in the opening strike, makes the calculation about what deterrence actually requires going forward. North Korea made that calculation in 2006. The lesson North Korea drew from watching Saddam Hussein disarmed and then killed and Iraq invaded was that the only thing that prevents American military action is a nuclear weapon. That lesson is now available to be drawn again by Iran, with far more resources and far more advanced scientific infrastructure than North Korea had in 2006. The most important passage Morgan wrote in Deterrence, a conceptual analysis, was not about any specific adversary. It was about what happens to the broader international system when deterrence fails visibly and consequentially. He wrote that the most lasting damage of deterrence failure is not the war it produces. It is the lesson it inscribes. When a state survives a massive American military campaign and maintains the ability to retaliate, every other state in the system updates its model of what is possible. The cost of challenging American power is recalculated. The credibility of the threat is revised. And some of those recalculating states will reach a different conclusion than they did before, that the risk is more manageable than it appeared, that the threshold is higher than it seemed, that the deterrence that shaped their behavior for 30 years has developed, in Morgan's word, rot. Iran normalized the war. 45 years of sanctions already made hardship the baseline. The bombs did not shock a comfortable society into submission. They unified a fractured one. The officer posting complaints about his $119 a month salary on Telegram is now defending his country. The protesters in the streets against the regime 6 weeks ago are now at rallies waving flags. When the foreign enemy arrives at the gate, Iran does not fracture. It consolidates. That is 7,000 years of civilizational memory functioning exactly as it always has. And America is discovering, as every power that has tried to bomb Iran into compliance has discovered, that the cost of yes for Iran is always higher than the cost of no. Morgan wrote that deterrence can rot, that its credibility depends on the accumulated weight of history, demonstration, and consequence, and that the most dangerous moment in any deterrence relationship is not when the adversary becomes powerful enough to challenge you. It is when the adversary decides the calculation has changed, when the fear is gone, when the threat that shaped a generation of decisions no longer shapes any. Iran stopped fearing a hypothetical war because it is already living in one, and it is still standing. That is the trap of surrender, and no weapon yet built can spring it open from the outside,